Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I'm very happy that you're joining me for the conversation. You can find more at facebook.com/nostalgiatrap. If you like the Nostalgia Trap Facebook page, you'll get updates on new episodes and links to all sorts of stuff related to the show and to the guests that are on it. You can also search for the show on iTunes. You can also find the show at the show's webpage, which is at nostalgiatrap.libsyn.com. Libsyn is Libsyn. So there's lots of places for you to find these conversations. And again, I have many more exciting discussions to come in the next few months. So please join me and we'll see where this goes. Okay, so my guest today is Professor Laura Tanenbaum. She is a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College. She's someone whose work I've admired for a while. I've watched some of her work on the web. On jacobinmag.com or at her blog Golden Notebooks, and I'll have links to some of her work. Her pieces are about feminism and American culture, about politics and history. She's someone who takes a very interdisciplinary American studies type approach to the work she does. And her writing is always funny. It's always engaging, and I think of her especially in some of the contentious Facebook political debates I've witnessed her participate in. Her voice is one that I always associate as the voice of reason. I think I ask her directly in this conversation where she developed that, and it's really great to hear her tell a little bit more of her history, because I've only seen her on the internet and heard her. Heard of her work through friends, and so it was great to finally sit down with her. She has a lot of things to say about a lot of different issues in American life right now. But one of the things we talk about a lot is Fight Club. She did a great piece on Fight Club that I'll link to on the Facebook page. And that movie had a big effect on me when I was young, and I think I'm still kind of figuring that out, and she definitely helped me unpack what that movie meant to us when it came out in the late 90s, 15 years ago. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation with me and Laura Tanenbaum. Again, if you want more, there will be more episodes coming, and you can like the page on Facebook. You can find more on iTunes. I even have smartphone apps on the way. So lots of exciting stuff here happening here at Nostalgia Trap. And again, I hope you enjoyed this conversation between me and Laura Tanenbaum. Laura, I know you, and I think we just found out that you may know me exclusively from the internet. I know you mainly from, I think, discussions I've seen on Jacobin or Jacobin People's Facebook pages. There's some epic fights on those pages, and I always was kind of scrolling through after a while once I recognized who you were and knew that you worked at LaGuardia, where I happen to know a lot of people. That you were like a voice of reason. I wanted to know, like it seemed to be like somehow you're able to like contain all these contradictions. So I'm happy, and I thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thanks.
Maybe we can start and figure out like how'd you get so smart? That's kind of what I want to know. When you were young, you said you grew up in outside of Chicago.
Yeah.
Is that right? What kind of kid were you?
Well, I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and my family is an academic family of a particular kind. They're mostly scientists. My grandfather was a pediatrician at the University of Chicago, and that was sort of the, in some ways a typical Jewish, that was the penultimate of the best thing to be, because, he's a doctor and working with children, but also an academic. My father's a physicist. So I grew up a lot with that, and a lot with just sort of this expectation that, children are part of the conversation and expected to kind of keep up and that. So I think that was really great for me, just in terms of, awakening that kind of curiosity.
Sounds like there would be a rigor to the childhood in a certain sense.
Yeah. And so, I kind of came at reading and, my own intellectual and political interests from kind of a couple different directions, I think I did sort of, have a sense, as a lot of kids do, of sort of breaking away from the family, in the sense that I was sort of, always interested in the arts and interested in creativity and expression, and in a way that I thought was sort of different from the sciences, but I think actually are kind of complementary in certain ways. But I also sort of, bridge both of those worlds. I sort of, I'm sort of like, I feel like I have sympathy for where sort of more purely artistic, people are coming from. I have sympathy from where political people are coming from, and where sort of more, the vulgar empiricists among my friends. So
science is so often pitted against the humanities. As educators, we know that, I guess, that there's a kind of like practical application of science, at least if people feel that way, and that humanities is kind of more of a abstract kind of place. Was there balance in your house growing up of that, or did you feel it was like a very science rational?
It was a very science sort of oriented environment, in ways that I think did really help me, in the sense that, I do always sort of have that, even when I, teaching composition, and say, okay, how do you know that that's true? And I said, I thought it was English class, and you can say whatever you want. So that idea that even if you're not in a world where there's verifiable truth, there is still kind of such a thing as evidence, and a better argument, sort of comes naturally. But
I think I'm always trying to communicate that idea to my students, that as much as we have the feeling, especially now, that like every opinion is valid, there's still a process, and there's still kind of there's still better opinions than others. Like there's still more defendable opinions than others, I guess.
Well, and just the idea of a process, and that we're hopefully trying to engage students in a process, and modeling it for them of what argument and exploration, whether that's in a creativity based way or in a argument based way, sort of engaging that process fully.
So how does that consciousness develop? As I guess humanities people, and you teach English,
that's right?
And I teach history, and there's. I feel like, especially going through the process of graduate school, you learn. I mean, some people call it like the secular trinity of like race, class, and gender.
Yeah.
But like developing those kind of ideas around those subjects, I think is kind of a critical part of being an academic now, especially. Do you think those things happened all at once for you, or what was it that kind of made you start to be aware of those things?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in high school, I got very interested for some reason in the 60s, I guess, as a lot of people maybe around my age did, because it was just far enough in the past that, I didn't have any awareness of it. And, I sometimes think about just the fact that people I've met who are just a little bit older than me, who, I was born in the 70s, but don't, have any, my first
much
memories, really are, the Reagan era. Yeah. And so that, I remember just sort of learning in school when they say, there's this pendulum and it swings back and forth. And I thought, okay, great. So, by the time the 90s come, it'll swing. And, I started college and thought, Clinton, okay, it's back. And then I realized it really wasn't. And so, that idea of sort of an era coming to an end, in the 70s, and all that. And, which in some ways maybe overly imagined in our minds, the way that, things right before we remember seem.
Well, I mean, the 60s kind of are, our nostalgia trap in a sense, because, they're kind of the liberal baby boomer nostalgia trap, at least, because that was an idealized time. And
sure, and I think, having read a lot about that period, obviously now, you can make a lot of interesting arguments, and I do find interesting to look at, the social movements of that period and their successes and failures. But for me personally, I think that along with that, when I was quite young, a teenager, I got pretty interested in feminism and did quite a bit of reading around that. And it was really kind of striking, just because you had this sense of such a huge change so recently, you know,
Yes.
and that sort of visceral sense of, you know, my life will be quite different than
And didn't
my
realize when
mother's
we were
or
young how
grandmother's.
close it was, you know,
yeah.
that change was, you know, as I get older, I realize that the 90s were, you know, 20, 25 years ago now. And
Right.
it doesn't seem that long ago at all. And when you talk about, you know, coming of age in the 80s and 90s, the 60s were right there.
They were right there, but they seemed a long way away to us. And
Yes.
so I think that, you know, it is interesting. And of course, you know, now having looked more, you know, I'm very interested in feminist history and, you know, the history of the movement in particular. And I think that in a lot of ways, even though that movement was in many ways, you know, very strikingly successful, that the history itself is often sort of not very well known, especially even among leftists, in the way that if you look at sort of civil rights, which almost you could say, you know, in certain ways was not as successful, but the history is more known. It's, you know, it's always tricky to make these
We tend to be pretty reductive about both movements, I feel like, but particularly feminism is kind of centered around, you know, Betty Friedan wrote a book.
Right.
And then once she wrote that book, everything changed because we all read it.
Right.
And it kind of masks it. It's I just saw an article, I don't know if it's on Jacobin, but about Cesar Chavez. Yeah, it is Bosco's article, I think, about the kind of, you know, the problem of locating these movements in like one book or one person, and realizing that it was a much larger and wider process.
Yeah, and I think with feminism in particular, you know, because the 50s have become such an iconic, you know, idea of the before, that there's this sort of flattening out of everything before that. And what is interesting, I mean, if you read The Feminist Mystique, it is actually a very interesting book. And one of the things I realized when I read it is that it's Backlash. You know, when I read the Backlash, which came out in the 90s, you know, when I was in high school in the early 90s, and sort of, you know, helped me sort of understand what my understanding at the time of what had happened, that, you know, that idea that of a social movement, you know, provoking opposition and how successful that was. And then it's interesting because if you read The Feminist Mystique, she's really writing Backlash. She's sort of saying, you know, there was this great feminist movement, you know, all throughout the 19th century, the suffrage movement. And then, you know, in many ways after suffrage was won, there was this backlash, and she's sort of berating, you know, the college girls of the 50s for being so, you know, retrograde and marrying younger, and, you know, the way that things went backwards so much.
Right, because there was like a feminist moment in, you know, around the Depression, World War II, with women being deeply involved in labor unions in the 30s, and then, you know, everyone kind of, there's another kind of nostalgia trap of the cliche of Rosie the Riveter, but the reality is women were working more so than ever before, and then that's what Friedan is writing again.
The history of the, you know, suffrage movement, which is, you know, very interesting, you know, in the U.S. and Britain, and, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, had its problems, but I think it's interesting, you know, just and has these sort of iconic moments that don't seem to be as iconic. Like if you think about, you know, the forced feedings. I mean, there's just such these dramatic stories, and so that's interesting to me. You know, just on a somewhat more superficial level, perhaps. You know, on the notion of the nostalgia trap, I noticed that Netflix was promoting this week all the back episodes of Mad Men because the new season is coming up, and they had one apparently that said before feminism there was Peggy Olson. And it's which you know, I mean, okay, it's Netflix, but see, you know, it is pretty remarkable just in the sense of like, okay, you know, not only that by the time, you know, the show is on, you know, the season's already happening, but it's like, hello, you know, even just the most superficial knowledge that you learn in 5th grade of like,
and poor Peggy
Susan
too,
B. Anthony,
you know?
and poor Susan B. Anthony and Margaret Fuller and you know, and
feminism
you know,
happened in 1962. You know, it's definitely problematic kind of historical construction, and something that is probably the reason why, you know, feminism has such a weird kind of power as a word in our cultures, because it's not really understood. Go ahead. Yeah,
which I think is interesting, and, you know, and in some ways people argue, you know, if you break down, you know, what feminism stands for, people are sort of more in support of it, so you can kind of look at that and say, well, you know, I guess it's better that people believe in the ideas and not the word than the other way around.
Same with the word welfare.
Right.
If you describe it to people as a structure, then they agree with it. But if you say the word welfare, most people say, I don't believe in that. And it's part of our politics for sure. I wanted to ask you about culture and backlash because in terms of just general anti-feminist backlash, the era that we grew up in, the pop culture of the 1980s had this backlash kind of flavor to it. I think of there's actually a book written about this, about the kind of the romantic notions about the 1950s, like Back to the Future, really popular, but also like this is the era of Die Hard and Lethal Weapon, this kind of like Rambo, we need to reclaim our masculinity, and it has to do with Vietnam and things like that. Were you aware of that as that was happening? Because it's not something that I thought of when I was a kid. I just thought Rambo was popular,
Yeah, I was aware of it partly just because the area where I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago was a pretty conservative area. And so even though my parents weren't particularly politically active, there was a definite sense that, they were liberal and, very different from the environment we were growing up in. I think, in a more systematic way, though, it does connect to what I was saying about feminism and, Backlash obviously, talks a lot about that era, less from sort of the, action movie military side, but just from the sort of, the idea of that domestic valorization. So I do actually have a kind of strong memory of watching a lot of that stuff when I was a kid, not so much the diehards, but just a lot of television shows that were sort of about how, sad working women and their sad babies who were being left behind and that kind of thing. And I actually remember
that was the start of that awful meme of like, can a woman have it all thing?
Yeah,
the, like, working woman. I mean, Working Girl. I don't know if you remember that movie.
Yes,
but these issues were tackled. Like other Hollywood movies, in ways that were both encouraging and discouraging, right?
Sure, yeah. Well, and I think that's where, again, like that idea of kind of, the 70s and that breaking point is so fascinating because, a lot of people, I think, you look to the Hollywood of the 70s, right? And you look to, New Yorkers, things like Dog Day Afternoon and, how kind of great and anti-authority and radical they are. Yeah. But, even on the gender stuff that's sort of not as on the surface radical when you look at from the 70s and even into the early 80s is just really kind of amazing. I mean, even, sort of something like Kramer versus Kramer, where, at the end, Dustin Hoffman makes this whole speech about how, the unfinished, my wife says that, women need to, pursue their ambitions, and that's true, but it's also true that men need to, be free to be nurturers. And, it's kind of remarkable. And, The Incredible Shrinking Woman, that movie, just brilliant sort of take on that stuff from just so much of a smarter way than what you were getting like 4 or 5 years later. So, it's always hard because it is always sort of like what you just missed was the golden age, but it does seem like there was some real break there. I mean, of course you can't directly correspond the pop culture to what was going on, but there's some break there.
That's kind of what I wanted to ask you a little bit is because you do write about culture and you write about literature and connect that to politics. And so how do you do that? Because we don't have to go into like deep critical theory here, but kind of like, how do you envision the connection between, either popular culture or even unpopular culture and the political zeitgeist?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I sort of struggled with a little bit and kind of ended up writing about this stuff in part because I was interested in both, and so it made sense to bring them together. And there are times where it can feel like a strain, right? And sort of some of the cultural studies thing of and where social scientists will say, oh, you English cultural studies people think that, deconstructing this, you are the movement. And says, no, I don't think that. I think activism is activism, and, I respect people who do that. So I do sometimes think that, there is a place for both, and it's tricky to, always be wanting to be at that intersection. But nonetheless, I think that pop culture and unpopular, whatever you want to call it, in a way, do touch on things in interesting ways. And what I've come to and why I like writing for a place called the Jacobin is because I think if you can just sort of explore those connections in a non-schematic way and not necessarily having to make any great claims about, Bayes and superstructure and reflection, but just use them as ways into looking at lost moments of cultural memory or, working through certain paradoxes like that. I find that it can be rich, and I find that, just sort of being able to do that in a kind of loose essay way
I agree.
Works well for that.
I feel like, you don't have to understand or even read the Frankfurt School to know that being able to read the culture is important. Being able to we call that critical thinking is kind of the buzzword in academia, but being able to have a critical kind of perspective on the culture that's being, more or less forced upon us. And I'm talking about even just living in New York, and reading the signs on the subway, and reading the advertisements on the subway. Some of them are deeply ideological. A lot of them are deeply ideological, and I think that being able to read that ideology is an important part of kind of moving past it in a sense. I read your piece on Fight Club, and I want to get to the 90s. It seems like the 90s was the moment where people from our generation kind of came of age, watching MTV, and I don't know if that was your experience, but where were you when the 90s happened?
Yeah, well, I was in high school, at the beginning, and I think, again, it's hard to know what feels like a break is very subjective. I think that, I went to college, I was in college, through a good chunk of the 90s. And
where did you go to college?
I went to Smith College. So the feminist piece,
Sure, yeah.
I had gotten interested in that. I decided to go there. And, it's a really interesting place to be. And I think that being in a place that has sort of that particular history tradition is very useful, and you can point to all the limits of, 90s identity politics, and,
we'll get to that.
We can talk about that. But I think that being in an environment that has a particular political and cultural and historical identity to it, no matter how flawed, is useful to a thinker. Because I think that, I sometimes I think about, Mary McCarthy in the Memoirs of a Catholic Girlhood, and she sort of talks about the Catholic propaganda she was taught in high school. And she says, but, it made me interesting in history, even though it was cartoonish and these were the villains and whatever, but it was a story. And, sometimes when people are sort of given a mishmash or, there's no narrative to it, right? There's no story. And so, all narratives are ideological, but a flawed narrative gives you kind of a way in then to see the problems and add elements onto it.
Yeah, sure.
So I think, being in a place that had that particular identity and sense of its own tradition and sort of mythology about Betty Friedan, among other things, was very useful to me in a lot of ways.
Well, I think that's kind of what part of the nostalgia trap is for me about the 90s is kind of, we're at a point where with the left, and I said we'll get to this, but there's this conversation about identity politics, and I came of age at a time where that stuff was not only communicated to me as very important, but I internalized it as very important. And so as the left kind of embraces a conversation about moving past identity politics, I'm both kind of, in agreement with, feeling like, certain things need to be focused on more. But at the same time, I feel really uncomfortable, especially as a white guy, saying, maybe we should not focus on feminism or black people's problems or, the problems of faced by, all these identity categories. It just doesn't feel like it's something that I can't move forward completely with. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that, it's tricky. I mean, identity politics, it can be used to mean and describe a lot of things. I mean, I think that, some of where maybe the critiques or debates that you're talking about, are sort of coming from is a sort of, revitalization of thinking about Marxism and talking about, economic-based politics, which I think is great and necessary and all that. I think that, sometimes identity politics is used to mean things that are, sort of purely symbolic, like, how many, writers of X background are, published and things like that, which I agree is,
It could be. It can be cartooned.
Can be cartooned, but I think that if you use if you use that term simply to mean, race and gender, instead of class, then it's a little bit trickier because
it's
I think
not an either or. Yeah, it can't be.
Yeah, well, I think that people talk about people on the left sometimes talk about mainstream feminism and critiques of it, or of course feminism needs to be class-based. I mean, I say of course, obviously, a lot of it depends on who you're talking to, right? If you're talking to Marxists, then, you say, well, of course feminist needs to be, that's not an of course to everybody. But I do think that we have to be careful sort of what we're talking about when we talk about, sort of mainstream feminism is not, it's not just Sheryl Sandberg or Jezebel. I mean, there are large feminist organizations that could be called mainstream, like the National Organization for Women. And if you look at what they're doing, they're talking about keeping, Planned Parenthood clinics open in Texas, which is completely an economic issue, right? Reproductive rights is completely an economic issue. So, I think it depends on how things are framed.
Right. Yeah. And I agree with you. And I think that people can, obviously frame identity politics is such an umbrella term that they can frame and throw whatever they don't like into that bucket and say that feminism is trigger warnings instead of Planned Parenthood, right? And that conversation that's being had right now is I think it's useful in some ways and it's a trap in another way.
Yeah. I think it can be a trap. And to be quite honest, I don't spend a lot of time on online debates because of lack of time. And so, there is sometimes that element of, we shouldn't be online. We should be organizing. Yes, I can't agree more that, Monty Python, it's time to act. Yes, I agree.
It's an echo chamber. And, I was talking about this the other day with a friend about Facebook. The algorithm actually, kind of reinforces this. If you, for instance, and I did this as an experiment, if you click on liking, I liked a bunch of sports teams just to see what I would get back. And all of a sudden I'm seeing friends that I've never really seen in my timeline before talking about sports. And so since I click and like on so many and I guess participate in so many political discussions, most of what I get is political. But not only is it political, it's kind of stuff that reinforces the things I already believe or the conversation. So there is a kind of like a sectioning off of people into these little tribes where here's the trigger warning conversation happening forever and ever and ever among the same people. So I think for me the social network thing and social media thing is yet to be marshaled in a way that can be useful, but it is fun to jump in there all the time. I never heard. We got to get back to Fight Club because I'm actually watching the Fight Club right now. It's one of those movies that I go back to a lot. I don't know why. I think part of it is just nostalgia about the time.
Every man of around my age, that movie.
And I think you and just to like kind of I don't know if I'll do a good job of this of summarizing your position on it. But I did want to ask you because I think you did a great job of kind of communicating how in order to like Fight Club, you have to kind of cleave yourself into sections because there is, especially as a male, I like how you kind of frame the movie as it kind of chastises you for being into the IKEA nesting instinct, and it tells you that the way out is through brutally fighting each other, and then at the end it kind of like chastises you again for falling for the fantasy of the brutality. But did you watch Fight Club in the 90s? Was this something that
I mean, I'm maybe a little bit older than the people that really, because I was already out of college, so I imagine I was maybe a little bit older than the people that it was a total cult movie for.
Sure.
But I think, it was, I remember thinking about it a lot because when I started teaching in graduate school as a TA at NYU when I was like 24, so I had students not much younger than me. So it was around then that it had come out, or it had just come out, and it was, and I had all these, film kids at NYU, and that was, the movie for them for a long time, for years and years. They were obsessed with it.
Full disclosure, I was in film school when Fight Club came out, and it had a kind of hypnotic effect on particularly the young men in the program.
Yeah, and I think, it's one of those things, and his books, too, which I haven't read, are sort of in that space as sort of, and still with students, I find, books that are read by people who don't read a lot.
Yeah,
sort
sure.
of like Bukowski, people who don't read poetry, Bukowski, and young
and
guys.
Paul and Yuck is definitely in that category.
So it is interesting in that way, and
it's almost culty. Like I wouldn't read anybody else because Paul and Yuck's the only guy that gets it.
He's
right?
the only one who tells the truth. And I think that it. Yeah, so I got it. But then a friend of mine actually, Ben Balthazar, who's a really great literary and cultural critic. Wrote a more sort of, formal academic paper where he talked about that movie along with other stuff in terms of 90s culture and, the anti-consumerism and, sort of related to the anti-sweatshop stuff that was going on in the 90s. And so I thought it was just, it was interesting how there's sort of a long tradition of sort of linking that anti-consumerism with a certain kind of, macho, rejection of the maternal, right?
Yeah,
and,
like the duvet thing. Like guys like us shouldn't know what a duvet
thing,
is.
But it's interesting, and it also has those lines in it where it says, he says, well, you should get married. And he says, well, we're a generation raised by women. I don't think another woman is the answer.
That line always, these lines always. I kind of cringed when these lines came. Like for me, the movie, I think I'm fascinated by it because of the contradictions it brings up in myself.
Yeah.
Those lines I always felt like were just kind of blatantly communicating what this movie was saying.
Yeah, it's true. It's pretty on the nose, but it I don't know. It just resonates, I guess, because most films sort of don't do that or don't do it that blatantly in ways that people sort of respond to in a popular sort of package. But yeah, I mean, the thing that made me write the blog post that you're talking about, there was this. I had been noticing, there's a lot in these articles now talking about the recession or talking about, I guess the, millennials, sort of younger folk, and, the snowflake trope.
Yeah,
right?
I loved how you kind of framed that turn. Because, can you explain that idea?
So the snowflake thing was that, you'll see this mentioned all the time in articles, and I think it was, I can't remember if it was Christoph or Brooks or one of these guys. I think it was David Brooks, but they're all the same.
One of those times.
Who wrote one of these, columns about how, the problem with these people, that they have these high expectations, and, this idea like everybody got a trophy in sports is a, related meme you hear all the time, which I just think is fascinating because it's sort of like, oh, that's the problem with our culture, is that we don't have enough ruthless division between winner and loser.
Yeah, and we coddle our children. Yeah.
And then you hear this term like special snowflakes, and like you think your kid is a special snowflake, which I think is fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating to me, on a certain level, just now that I'm a parent, where you sort of think like, well, yes, I think my kid is a special snowflake, and I understand that can be sort of retrograde if it means that I think my kid is better than everybody else and entitled to all these, privileges that I will deny to other people's children. But I do think that the inherent, thing that most parents feel about the unique amazingness of your child is actually a real and profound and, sort of inherently anti-capitalist thing, sure. Right? That we don't think our kids are widgets. Like we do think that they are
special, meaningful,
profound, like all those things.
Yeah.
And every kid actually can be that, right? Which is
that's a paradox that I think I've been mentioned on this show before. Is the paradox of American culture, which is how do you have a democracy? How do you have community in a culture that values individualism so powerfully? I think it's that conversation is being had in this snowflake way, in a kind of simplistic way.
Right. So, I picked up on that, and, it made me think about how that line at the beginning of Fight Club, which I just remember hearing quoted all the time when people saying like, this guy say, you are not a special snowflake, right?
You're the same dying organic
material. And every day. So it was sort of being, again, taken in this way, in the sense of you're being coddled, but at the same time, right, the movie is sort of, as you're saying, flattering people, saying, but actually you are a special snowflake because you're going to be part of this cool little club.
Right.
Right. And you're going to be the only one who's living, in this
authentically.
visceral way.
Yeah, there's a really
right.
annoying moment in that movie where Brad Pitt and Edward Norton are on the bus and they're looking at images of like men in their Calvin Klein underwear, and Brad Pitt says something like, "Is that what a man is supposed to look like?" And they almost
it's Brad Pitt,
right? And I was like, wait, it's ironic that Brad Pitt is saying that, but also. It kind of captures what you're saying, which is that it as much as they're about losing their individuality, they're also, very, very clearly, the position in the film is smarter than everybody else.
Yeah.
Right. There's like almost an elitism too. They see through the bullshit, and they're the only ones that are liberated because they get things that are kind of self-evident to a lot of people. I think. Right.
Yeah. I know, absolutely, and I think that. But to me, I mean, not just to pick on all the men of my generation, quoting that movie when they're telling their girlfriends why they don't want to go to IKEA and buy furniture, and how the couch is a step away from...
Watch this clip from Fight Club and you'll explain why I don't want to go. The couch is one step away
from the coffin. I remember that particular quote from a conversation. But, but not just to pick on that, but I do think that sort of particular... take on things, to me, and the individuality question is very much tied to feminism and gender, in the sense that, thinking about my own evolution, I remember when I was in college reading Adrienne Rich's book of Women Born, about the politics of motherhood, which I wrote about also in the Jacobin. And it's in some ways, it's very much a book of the 70s, and, might be termed by a lot of people sort of essentialist in terms of some of the, anthropology she does or talks about. But I just remember this one line really sticking with me when I read it in college, which was, she said, she talked about, she had been an award-winning poet, she won this contest judged by W.H. Auden, but then, like many women at the time, got married quite young, had several children quite young before she later came out. Mm-hmm. But she talked about, so she was talking about that experience of being a young mother and just sort of feeling like she was a part of this like eternal thing that never changed,
Sure.
And, and she said, I had to work through that and discard a lot of the mythology. But then she says, but even still, she said, I had to give up the idea of my own uniqueness. She said, in order to have any authentic life at all, I had to give up, this idea of my uniqueness, and that, these problems that those women face are not really that different from mine. And I just think that for sometimes young people being politicized, right, that sort of sense of alienation from the culture, whether, sort of desired or thrust upon us by virtue of, our experiences and an inability to fit in, can sort of take us a little bit into that trap of feeling like, this is what the culture is. And, the problem is that, in Peoria, and the kind of things that movie flatters, instead of just sort of thinking about, we all live in this culture which has this cruelty and inequity, and it impacts us in various ways,
right? And it's a confused politics in that movie. I mean, at the end, I think by the time the buildings are collapsing and Helena Bonham Carter and Edward Norton are holding hands, and the Pixies are playing, I feel like there's no one at the helm of the ship anymore, because unless Zizek did a kind of brilliant rant on this movie, and the way he frames it is kind of like he loves it. He thinks it's like it's about kind of containing all the contradictions of what you need to do to become a revolutionary. But it is, it's an incredibly male-centered movie, and I mean, that might be the obvious thing to say about Fight Club, but it really is framing revolutionaries as men, and that process is men breaking out of this shell that they're in. Helena Bonham Carter's character kind of exists as a cipher in the movie. I haven't thought through her character as much as I should, but did you notice her?
Yeah, I mean, I always just like her.
Yeah, she's awesome.
She's sort of delightfully sort of wild, and it's like the punk nihilistic version of the manic pixie dream hallucinated girl or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But so I dig that. Yeah, I mean, I think though, just in terms of constructing people's identity of what a revolutionary is. And you started, by sort of asking me about, why I'm the reasonable voice and these debates. And, I do think that...
I only mean reasonable because I feel like you are balanced, not in a Fox News way.
Right. Well, I think that's interesting because I think I am sort of not a particularly confrontational person by nature. And so I think that when you're in a cultural or political moment where the center is so far out of whack, the idea of sort of being in the center or reasonable or seeing both sides can sound like it's Fox News.
Sure.
But that in fact, if you're sort of having the right debates, and having sort of smart liberal left, debates about, race and class or about, pragmatism, utopianism, then it's not always such a bad thing to sort of, operate in that space of finding both sides. It's only when, the poles of reasonable are like crazy right wing and
sure, yeah,
that's like a terrible thing to be.
Yeah. So moving past Fight Club in the 90s, what was your cultural orientation? What were the things that you were into? Was there a particular scene that you identified with or didn't identify with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's taken me a while. I'm maybe still finding it. I think, at Smith, I was very interested in some of the things that have been going on in the 90s as far as sort of the sort of Riot Girl stuff and the, that sort of stripe of the culture. I wasn't really part of it, but I was sort of a consumer of it,
sure,
right? I was younger than the people making it, but the right age to kind of be a consumer of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, and sort of things like Bitch Magazine, right? Which were kind of doing that kind of criticism.
And
I was
Sassy Magazine was around that time too.
Yeah. So that, that stuff was particularly sort of interesting to me, but I didn't really find a political outlet. And I think that, I sort of turned in the academic direction. And then in graduate school, when I came to NYU, I got involved in the graduate union there. And that's where I sort of began to think more in terms of activism and sort of what it was.
So around labor issues.
Around labor issues, yeah. And that sort of particular culture.
Can you talk a little bit about that experience at NYU? Because I know that their graduate students have a different experience than perhaps I'm aware of from CUNY, because we're both both being squeezed but in different ways. So what is it at NYU? What's the problem with the administration there?
Yeah, well, I was involved. You might know back in 2000 there was a labor board case where the teaching and research assistants there had filed a petition with the National Labor Relations Board for union recognition, and we won that case and had an election, and I was on the committee that bargained their first contract that was then reversed when the Bush board came in, that led to a strike, and now 10 years later they've been re-recognized. I think NYU is an interesting place. It's a private university, as you know, that used to be a lot more like CUNY, used to be much more of a commuter school.
Yeah.
And then while I was there, and since even more so, was very into, sort of building its brand, becoming more like an Ivy, attracting more...
and installing itself in the neighborhood in a much more profound way.
Yeah. Sort of. So when all that was going on, the committee there was interested in, the labor issues that people are concerned on across academia, with adjunct faculty I also was involved in the adjunct campaign there. But, when we had that case in 2000, the issue in front of the labor board was, are we workers, right? And the university was arguing, this is apprentice model, right? And so that was just... That's
been a movement. That's and not just in academia, but everywhere. This kind of like, you're not a worker, you work for free. My students are all begging for internships. And the model is disturbing. And to see that in academia, and to see the administration resisting, even classifying you as having a job when you're, giving your labor is insane to me.
Yeah, so that was, I think that was an interesting moment to be there, and it was an interesting, this was sort of right after Seattle, so coming out of the 90s, there was that sort of excitement
Yeah,
about that.
I feel like the battle in Seattle you're talking about, 99, is kind of like the culmination of all that political energy in the 90s. I almost felt when Occupy Wall Street happened that it was like a kind of return to that form of politics, and I don't know what that means. I'm still kind of unpacking that. I think it'll be a while before any of us figure out what Occupy Wall Street meant. But yeah, the Seattle thing is so important. Where were you when that happened?
Yeah, I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't really involved there.
Neither was I, but it was meaningful to you.
Big, and it was, I came to New York City, right after I graduated college to go to graduate school. I came right in. I was very sort of sheltered and, and green, and I was in the comparative literature department at NYU, which was full of, very sophisticated, European people who knew, just sort of knew a lot of things that...
It sounds wonderful in a lot of ways.
It was great. It was great. I was just, I was sort of trying to figure out, where I was, and the Union for me really was sort of an intellectual political home in terms of just the people that I met there being the people that I wanted to be kind of spending time with and who were... sort of reaching out across, disciplines and just wanting to talk about what was going on instead of kind of trying to carve out your own one little niche, which I think, a lot of the things that we complain about in academia, are true. I think, I'm in a way sort of a big defender of academia to the extent that I think, flawed as it is, it's a important space to defend.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's just like identity politics, right?
Yeah,
like these are things that have issues, but it doesn't mean we throw it all out. I mean, they're really important to us.
And I think that one of the issues that we do a lot of times face in academia is not so much, conspiratorial, or some evil thing, but just by the nature of sort of intellectual production that we're sort of trying to carve out, just like the way you sort of learn to make an argument in grad school, right?
Sure.
Like, so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so all make wonderful points, but what none of them point to,
right?
And just that sort of need to like...
I'm identifying the gap in the literature.
Differentiate that, which is, sort of a model that, sort of imitates from the sciences. It just works in a very different way. So, just being a part of any movement, even when, like myself, I'm not really an activist necessarily by nature, a very good organizer, but being a part where instead of trying to do that, you're actually trying to reach some kind of consensus, however flawed, right?
Sure.
And trying to,
well, there are different ways to be an activist,
instead
right?
of accelerate them, I think was a really important experience for me.
Mm-hmm. So you're in. It sounds like you're arriving at NYU in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So New York has been. Would you say being in New York has been a kind of political moment for you as well? Because the last 10 years since you've moved to New York, I said 10 years, but 15, it's been 15 years.
Plus, yeah.
Right. This has been, since even before 9/11, New York was changing dramatically. 9/11 is often, considered this breaking point, but the Giuliani stuff was before that.
Right.
How has New York City's recent history impacted your kind of political consciousness, if at all?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I mean, of course, change is, it's a constant and it's dynamic, and we identify sort of patterns, and certain ones seem very heightened in the moment, and certain ones appear in retrospect. I think that, it's a little bit difficult to say. I actually suspect and think that when we look back, 9/11 is going to seem way less of a...
I think, I know your trepidation in saying that.
A breaking point.
Yeah. I agree, though.
Than we think, in terms of, obviously, when you think about Seattle and the sort of energy that was, certainly there was sort of a sidetracking, and there was, everything that the Bush, period kind of came to represent. But I think that, if you're thinking about economic trends and neighborhoods, and just sort of that, if anything, 2008, and which is still being worked out, but that sort of is a much bigger sort of shift.
Well, it seems to me like, I don't know, it sounds like what you're saying is, you might agree with this, that we needed Obama in a sense to make us see that Bush was not the anomalous devil that he was made to be, but part of a much wider system. And for the left, I think in particular, Obama's that moment, and realizing that Obama was perhaps not what the left invested in him is kind of realizing that it's much bigger than just these personalities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, people's political, evolution in relationship to, some of the various cultural and intellectual formations, and then you sort of have these artificial electoral cycles laid on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
And, part of when, again, it's you hate to use a generational frame for everything, but, part of when you look at sort of excitement around Obama and think sort of, well, how did people get so swept away? I think, partly it's just that when you've lived through a few elections,
yes,
it's kind of hard to imagine how that could seem dramatic to people.
Right.
But I remember Clinton seeming dramatic to me.
Sure.
So, which you presumably had even less objective reason to think that than with Obama.
I think I might have had I'm embarrassed to say it, but I might have had like a tear when Obama was elected, the first time, right? I mean,
sure, because Reagan and Bush had been president since for as long as I could remember, right?
Uh-huh.
So yeah. But I think that with the Obama era, I mean, and I'm definitely never one to say, there's no difference. I think that, I have a lot of respect for, progressives who work, at the boundaries of electoral politics, especially on the local level, and try to push those,
Sure.
But I do think that, some of the exciting things going on, politically and intellectually now, you do have this sort of sense that when you have an Obama situation, you can have a better debate, right? Because you can go back to the left, left liberal debate rather than just the, oh my God, these are crazy people debate. Which, you can argue, obviously, in a lot of ways, Obama's not even a liberal. He's centrist or conservative. Mm-hmm. But at least, that frame is there to kind of use that language. And, I do think that a lot of younger people I meet who, sort of were actually, quite shaped by Obama, experience and sort of speak in ways that seem very, sort of idealistic to my tongue, which could be that lingering 90s sort of sensibility. But I don't think that's necessarily inherently a negative thing.
So, speaking of that 90s sensibility, do you think it's a mistake for us to think of the 90s as this like different political moment? I feel like people put Kurt Cobain in the same category as like Jim Morrison or something. Like that was the 60s, like that in that pendulum kind of model that you spoke of earlier, that the 90s were the kind of swing back. Do you think that's a mistake? And do you feel like, I mean, the way I think about it is that there were outlets in the popular culture for radical kind of ideas, and that watching even MTV and seeing things like Rage Against the Machine were made me curious about things I didn't know about, and I don't know. Do you think our students, are in an environment similar to that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there's always, interesting things going on, right? There's, people, people in the 80s will talk about punk till your, ears fall off and this kind of thing. I think that, I think the early 90s in particular, just in terms of popular culture, there's sort of an interesting opening there. Mm-hmm. Less so grunge, sort of less interesting to me, but in hip hop and in the sort of Riot Girl stuff, I showed Do the Right Thing to my students recently.
Such an awesome movie.
Which
for starting a conversation.
Yeah, and I wasn't sure how it would go over, and it was one of the most interesting conversations I've had because, and in some ways you look at it and, just stylistically there's just certain things that are so, of that moment.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, the clothes that Spike Lee himself wears are just fantastic relics of that era.
And that same song over and over, 1989. But
Fight the power.
Yeah, but it really does not, feel dated, right? In that particular way. I think it was a moment. I mean, I think that period in particular, there was a moment where even in some way as a result of some of the awful conservative things and the backlash, that there was this sort of critical response to it where I remember, also like in high school being very just sort of, partly with the LA riots and all that kind of thing, just sort of aware, that people were talking about poverty and race and, in really awful retrograde ways like the inner city, but that it was something that, you had this sense that it was central to what was going on and you had to understand it,
Sure.
and that kind of, I think, faded away right during the sort of boom years.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure it's quite back in the same way, but there's certainly, I think, more of a sense of that kind of sort of energy or spaces.
Yeah, I agree. I'm remembering, the LA riots were huge for me because I was very close to that.
Yeah.
And so it was like actually like a fear that there was going to be, I was outside the suburbs and actually, the racial conversation was exactly what you would expect from the suburbs, right?
Yeah.
They're like, the hordes are going to come from the city and, the black hordes are coming to steal everything we have and kill us all. And that conversation, is something that you have to resist, and I think that when you're young, it's hard to find ways to construct it in a more kind of productive and sophisticated political way, right? Like and I'm talking about not only the conversations that I was experiencing around the suburbs, but the way the media portrayed the riots were almost in that way. If you watched news coverage of the riots, they weren't really talking about the social and economic kind of. So how did you figure that stuff out? Is what I guess I wanted to know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that I remember when that was going on that I was reading Invisible Man in my AP English history class and sort of reading that riot scene, and sort of making that connection. So I think that, one of the things I've always been interested in the sense is cultural history and sort of, where do echoes of these things happen and the way people that responded to them. So I was sort of talking about, earlier about the belief that, feminism first started in the 60s and I think that, the piece I wrote recently for the Jacobin about, Brooklyn nostalgia, I was just sort of interested in, people's conversations about gentrification and hipsterdom and, as if it was a new thing, right? And just sort of thinking about, okay, well, what, where does this come from? And one of the things that really struck me that I was interested in that piece was how, the sort of history of hip, as you will, right? And the history of Bohemia, right? Because if you're talking about people using culture as a way to kind of get critical, right? There's that sort of impulse young people have to, middle class people to kind of go to, some kind of counterculture. And from a certain political, and economic perspective, you say, well, the Bohemians are just kind of a subset, right, of the middle class. And so, and that perception that that's the role they play in gentrification, that they just pave the way for, other parts of the middle class, which, and from, I think that, the vulgar empiricist, just part of me sort of says, okay, well, people who really study this and understand the way that city planning and finance and real estate works, that's not really what's driving it, and that's important to understand. But
the hipsters didn't build the luxury condos.
No, but from the perspective of how we sort of think about these things and talk about the history of the places that we live and the culture of the places where we live, it's kind of striking how, it was striking to me how, this whole history of Bohemianism, right, is so tied up, right, in this country, of course, with, the whole idea of race and sort of racial appropriation and, different...
I think you mentioned the Norman Mailer white Negro piece.
Yeah, sort of relationships to black culture. And it kind of seemed to me that a little bit of what had happened more recently was that the certain strains of, hip culture had sort of kind of realized how awful, and look back at, Kerouac and you sort of like, all right, even a 19-year-old reading Kerouac now is like, all right, I want the fast car, but when he starts talking about the Mexicans, I'm just kind of cringing,
Yes.
So
yeah, those books are kind of, there's lots of cringing in the beats.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And part of that is because, the culture has changed around those issues.
And so I think that what was interesting to me was a little bit how, people now sort of having maybe reacted to that, there was this sort of sense of a bohemian culture that wasn't doing that, but in so doing just sort of cut itself off. And so there was a lot of sort of self-conscious whiteness, right? In recent hipster culture and, all the jokes about, white people this, white people that. And, I just thought, well, that's interesting though, because then it sort of leads to this thing where people talk about artists and bohemians, as if that's synonymous with white people, and doing that in a city that has, the richest tradition of Black, history, music, art, literature, like go down the line, it was really interesting to me. So I was kind of interested in just kind of going back and seeing, sort of what Baldwin was saying about that, and what, sort of earlier generations were saying about how we sort of invent a landscape for ourselves, right, in places that we come to. Yeah.
So we gotta wrap it up here, but I wanted to ask you just one last question because we didn't ever talk about you teaching, and how, because I teach in CUNY too, and it's there is a kind of political vibe to it, just being by nature of being in a working class school like CUNY. But how do you construct the relationship between your politics and your teaching, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing as I would about writing or creativity. I don't like to say claim this is my politics, right? Because I don't, I respect a lot what activists do, and I know kind of how much goes into trying to do that well, and so I don't claim it to be the same thing. I do think though that the classroom is a space where we can try to model or just give people a space to say, this is not just another place where we're going to do some bullshit thing. So you can write some bullshit thing that you can put in a drawer, or where you have to go to your shitty job, to just try to create a space where say, okay, we're going to take a deep breath. We're going to try to think and talk and breathe, and that shouldn't be a radical thing, or, and I wouldn't even claim that it's a radical thing, but it is sometimes a thing that, we don't have a lot of other spaces for. So
yeah, no, I agree. I think that might be the best way to think of a classroom, as a space where we do different things, and when I say different things, I mean we kind of try and break through the culture in whatever way we can, and break through the modes of thinking that they're going to be asked to do in other spaces that perhaps aren't as rich, or don't have as many opportunities for critical questions to be asked. Thank you, Laura, for sitting down with me. I appreciate it.